This is This Week in Perspective with me, Adam Simbeye. Kenyan elections were held on the 8th of August this year. By international standard observers, the elections were declared free and fair and held in a peaceful atmosphere, did they? The Independent Electoral Board of Kenya declared Uhuru Kenyatta president-elect. But the election of the president was challenged in the Kenyan Supreme Court by the opposition NASA party led by Raila Odinga. And the Supreme Court declared the election of Uhuru Kenyatta null and void and ordered for a fresh election within 60 days. Much has gone under the bridge since then, or even written in the media, everywhere in the world, particularly so in Africa. Much so in Africa, as I said. To discuss these elections and their implications to Kenya and probably the rest of Africa on democracy, with me are, on my right, Gift Kweka. She's a lawyer as well as a lecturer at the Open University of Tanzania. Welcome.
Thank you.
Professor Baregu, Mwesiga Baregu, a seasoned known political scientist with St. Augustine University. Welcome, Professor.
Thank you.
Last but not least, Professor Daudi Mukagara, also a political scientist, seasoned, well-known. My apologies, viewer. Judge retired Thomas Mihayo has not been able to make it. He wasn't feeling well for a couple of days, so he sends his apologies. So the three will be able to cover this topic without any problem. Let us do justice. So let's go straight, as we were told the time is limited. Why, in your view, has the Kenya elections once again attracted great interest within and outside Kenya? Professor Baregu?
Well, I think Kenyan elections, probably more than any other country in this region, attract attention mainly because of where Kenya has been for two reasons. One is that the 2007 to 8 election was very violent in Kenya. A lot of people were hurt in the process. About 100,000 people died. So that remains a point at which a point of reference for most people when Kenya is faced by an election crisis. And then the subsequent election again in 2013, it was also challenged, and therefore elections in Kenya have attracted attention continuously. Again, Kenya is holding this election. I think this is the second election being held by under Kenya's new constitution. And the route to a new constitution in Kenya were very, very difficult. And finally they agreed and they had the new constitution in place. Now the question is whether or not the constitutional mechanism that was established in the new constitution is working, and also to see whether Kenya can finally hold an election which can be described as free, fair, peaceful, and credible. Because I think it's a credibility thing that is at issue in this election. And it's not just a challenge for Kenya, because I think it is also an issue which cuts right across the African countries, and actually maybe across the world, because the digitalization of elections, the use of IT mechanisms is a big challenge. I think you would agree with, even to democratic theory, to what extent are elections now and in the future, election results, to what extent are they going to be really representative of the free expression of the voters' preferences in our country. So it's a very interesting election.
Yeah. Professor?
Yes, I agree with that. This is Kenya is interesting because some of the main players in the violence of 2007, 2008 are running. Professor there is quite right. That by itself generates interest, and not just in Africa, but everywhere. And of course, there is great competition between the two main presidential contenders, stiff competition. And you have an electorate which is divided almost 50-50 as such.
On what basis? On tribal basis or ethnic background or what?
Well, perhaps some of that, yes. But the point about it is, if you look at it, the same leading contenders, okay, were there in 2013, and one of them won by just 1,500 votes.
Yeah.
So really, this is basically a 50-50 kind of division. Questions of tribe or ethnic divisions, we can talk about that a little later on. But point is, you have an electorate divided almost 50-50 as such. And of course, if you look at the later questions, that means after the election, then the fact that for the first time in Africa, and for only the third time everywhere else, a court nullified the presidential election. That itself also becomes very interesting because it raises many questions of democracy, independence of the judiciary, and several others.
Okay.
Yeah.
Give to that to react to that question as well, or we move to the next one for
Yes,
you?
maybe just to add on what the professors have said, I think even events that preceded the first election, that is the 2017 August election, the death of Christy Sando just before the elections, I think it also drew the attention of not only the continent.
You mean
yes,
Sando? You mean the IT specialist?
The IT specialist, yes. It just drew the attention of everybody as to what will happen, what next to the elections.
Okay. Were the elections free and fair, as by international observers, in your view?
Yes, that is what the international observers said. The elections were free and fair. For me, my main concern was what did they look at for them to say the elections were free and fair?
The long queues.
Yes.
No fighting during the long
queues. No fighting, no long queues. Did they look at the process after the voting, where people casted voted, they went home? Did they look at the process after? Probably not. So for them, they based, I don't know what their mandate was, but they based their conclusions on events preceding the after voting. Yes.
Professor?
Two things. Yes, two things. Yes, the elections were free and fair, according to the international observers. And that's because theirs was an interim report.
Mm-hmm.
And in an interim report, you don't necessarily look at all the things that are important. So perhaps it may have been a little early to judge the international observers. And this is the second point. Even the Supreme Court of Kenya, that has nullified the elections, did not say the elections were not free and fair. They are talking about the process, that it was not transparent and verifiable. Those are two separate questions as such.
Eventually, I read somewhere, even John Kerry, who was representing the, what's this now, the center,
the Carter Center
in Georgia, and who participated as one of the international observers, said, well, we can't say much about free and fair, but the events leading to that can indicate that.
Yeah.
All right?
Well, yeah. Well, I think, this election actually poses very fundamental challenges to the concepts of free, fair, and credible. And it looks to me that in this electronic voting age, we are going to have to rethink some of these things. Free in the sense that, yes, people access the voting stations. Peaceful, yes, it was.
Thousands of
now,
them queuing
how
up.
do you determine fairness if, in fact, that is beyond the control of this process. In other words, in this case, fairness is more or less determined by the machines. And if somebody manipulates the machines, as it so happens, the Supreme Court agreed that was some hacking that took place in the computer system. I think it also indicates that from now on, election observers will have to be very, very careful on the issue of fairness, unless you're talking about logistical fairness, in the sense that everybody got equal access, everybody had their ballot papers, everybody got a chance to vote in a voting booth on their own.
No fighting.
There was
in the
no
queues.
harassment. There was no fighting. If that's your notion of free,
Yes.
that's fine, and I think that can be separated from fair, because fair, in my view, fair is somehow very closely related to the results
Yes.
rather than the process.
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah, I think this to me. So I think from now on, I think external observers will probably have to refrain from commenting on fairness
Just after voting.
Until they verified the process.
because if it's unverifiable, the results are unverifiable. Obviously, they cannot be fair. And my interpretation of the Supreme Court decision in Kenya is that by implication, I think there is some implication because they said that the Electoral Commission failed to carry out a democratic election following the rules, the law, the electoral law, and the Constitution of Kenya, that they were unable, either deliberately or they just blundered into it. So again, to me, fairness, they have commented on fairness. In other words, I'd think.
My panel, I better ask another question. Do you think the action of the Supreme Court of Kenya vindicated advocacy for credibility of election in Kenya and perhaps elsewhere in Africa?
Yes and no, I think, because the court is calling for an error-free electronic transmission of results. So to that extent, because this one had errors, they are quite right. But let me put some meat onto that particular argument, or let's clarify this particular argument to the court further. Okay. Now, it is the law in Kenya that the IEBC, the Electoral Management Body, cannot, should not announce the results unless there has been a transmission to them of all forms 34A and 34B. And I think the emphasis actually is on 34A. That is the forms which have recorded the results at the polling stations. Now, quite clearly, they didn't have all those forms when they declared the results, because I think some 11,000 of them out of in excess of 50,000 were not in the hands of the headquarters of the IEBC yet. At the same time, we must note that the law also says the IEBC cannot change the results. Okay? In other words, what is transmitted must be taken at face value. It cannot be changed by the IEBC. Now, what the IEBC relied on, and that has been their argument, whether we agree with it or not, that has been their argument, is that first of all, there was an electronic transmission of these results, of forms 34A as such. There was an electronic transmission of that. Secondly, that there was a scanning of forms 34A, because that is the requirement. And thirdly, that there was a scanning and transmission of the results containing in 34B, which is a tallying of the results at the polling stations. In other words, 34B assumes the results of all 34 A's in a constituency. So they felt that they had all the evidence, first of all, the electronic transmission, okay, of that, even without the forms 34A, and secondly, most of the forms 34A, and finally, most of the forms 34B, that they were in a good place to announce the results for the reason that they cannot change the results once they are transmitted. In other words, whether, for example, they had in their possession all forms 34A, or they didn't, it didn't matter very much as long as all the results had been electronically.
Let me cite what, as part of the ruling of the Supreme Court, which was issued on Wednesday, the 20th, just part of it. It says the Electoral Commission disobeying his order, or its order, in the Supreme Court's order, to open up the computer saver after opposition allegations of hacking and also failing to verify numbers before declaring Kenyatta winner, and lack of transparency.
Yes, that's their argument. My point though is this, perhaps I was, at this point I was simply saying actually that the law itself is not clear, because in one sense it says you can actually do this, in another it says you can't, okay? And what the Supreme Court has done is to take one part of the law which says you can't actually, even if you are sure by some other means, you can't declare these results unless you have collected in your hands all forms 34As. That's the law. So in that sense,
But I think,
and that's where they say it is not verifiable.
I think,
okay.
but yes.
Let me just add just one more
Yes,
point.
just one.
And secondly, in my opinion, I think if they had wanted, maybe they didn't have time, if they had wanted, they could have verified the results, because the results are contained in all forms 34A as well as forms 34B, which are not in the hands of the IEBC alone. These forms are never in the hands of the election management body alone. Party agents have the same copies of the results as such.
Let me respond. I think at the end of the day, we are talking about the election passing a verification test. And it looks to me that the IEBC, in its process, was not able to acquit itself, that they could really verify the results. And I think the court's decision basically more or less hangs around that point. But the other thing I want to ask, and I don't know whether you or me can answer this question at this stage, the time frame that the IEBC had at its disposal. Why the hurry? Why the haste to declare when in fact the records that are required by law, and that's why I think they say they cannot pick and choose parts of the law and parts of the Constitution. Why is it that I don't know whether there is a constitutional limit that they must announce results deadline X, and therefore they have to meet the deadline. And if that's the case, okay, then one lesson to be drawn from this exercise is that such a deadline is probably not.
More time is needed.
Yeah, more time maybe is needed, because the thing is, given the history of Kenya's elections, I think it should have occurred to the IEBC that the issue of verification, in order to make the election results credible. Because don't forget that everybody in Kenya more or less goes to these elections, on the one hand, thinking that the other side is going to rig it. So the confidence in the IEBC, right from the word go, is like hanging in there. They're not sure whether it's going to be an election that's conducted fairly. So the more reason why, in a situation like that, the IEBC had the obligation to exercise even more care in making sure that the results that are finally announced.
Anyway,
So
this is an important
I'm putting
point.
the political argument now, because it's not just the legal, because I'm not really very capable of law and legal arguments, but I'm saying politically, to be chairman of an IEBC, you want to be sensitive to what it is that you are going to announce, because literally people's lives,
do you want to react to that?
Yes.
before I ask,
Yes, you know,
Dr.
Professor
Kweka?
Baregu is right in many senses, but you see, what the Kenyan law has done, and that's the sense in which I was saying the court is right. What the Kenyan law has done is actually to elevate the electronic transmission of results, okay, and to ignore the results themselves. And in fact, this is said by the court itself in this particular judgment. They are saying, forget about the results.
Yeah.
Yes, look at the process. The process, they say, is not verifiable. I would argue differently. It is verifiable. It was simply not easily verifiable by the electronic means.
Exactly.
But actually by the manual means, it is very highly verifiable because you have the forms.
Yes,
Excellent.
They didn't have the time, yes.
But let me say this before we move on to another point. The issue of forms, don't forget that some forms are found to have no security. Security, what is it? What do you call it?
Yeah, there are also many counter arguments.
The watermark and
that
everything. I'm saying,
yes,
but the
yeah.
consistency then
Yeah.
is in question as to whether or not everybody in Kenya had the same ballot paper, or whether some people
I
voted.
mean, at every polling station.
At
it's
every,
the same.
literally to a person, it has to be the same. Even if one ballot paper escaped, which should not be counted. Now, it's a question of judgment. Then you can say, to what magnitude does it
Exactly.
How many?
affect the
How
results?
many,
How many?
yes, yes.
But it's not, then at that point with me, it's not a question of numbers. It's a matter of principle.
All right,
Okay.
okay. Now, this is a legal question. Let me ask Dr. Gifty Kweka to react on this, and perhaps you can also chip in. Do you believe the Supreme Court of Kenya did indeed establish democratic standards for Kenya's election and for elections in Africa?
I would say yes for the country's judicial independence, because this is the first time in the history of the African continent where a court has stepped outside and really acted independent of the ruling government and gave a decision against
The ruling.
the ruling government, actually the standing president, who is now standing for re-election. But on the issue of democracy, maybe even the political scientists will say more about it. I do not know whether really it has elevated the democratic standards, because now you've come into a position where we are going for re-election, for rerunning of the elections.
Which may or may not take
May
place.
or may not
Which
take
may or
place,
may
with
not
only
happen,
two
yeah.
people, Raila and Uhuru. The rest are no longer participating. They equally have the right to be voted for, those people who could not. Because if you're declaring the elections a nullity, it's as if they never were there. So why are you excluding all, even though they
The other
got 0.00%,
The
it
other
doesn't matter. Yes,
contestants.
they have the right to be voted for. And also the issue of judicial independence, maybe before I give room, it's not only on the ability of the court to issue decision. The judicial independence is a whole thing, and this is just one area. It's just one decision. But what about independence of the judges themselves? Now, after the decisions, are the judges really independent? We are seeing a lot of threats, a lot of issues coming up. So really,
Kenyatta himself did say that he accepted. He didn't accept the
Which
results.
is rather unfortunate.
But
Very
we'll
irresponsible.
go along with it and started calling the judges all sorts of names. Yeah?
so Judy, we have to look at it holistic, though it's really a milestone in the history of the African continent and Kenya in
Yes.
particular.
Very quickly, Professor.
Yeah, I think what she says that it was a milestone, and a milestone means we have to draw some lessons. This, I think this only became possible because the Constitution of Kenya allows it. that the voter, in fact, it's, anybody can
Anybody
actually
can challenge.
the results of any election. And
Is it constitutional for someone else, so-called Professor Wenaina, now going back to court
Yes.
to say the court must nullify its own decision to nullify the elections?
well, obviously, I mean, if it's a high court that's supposed to nullify the Supreme Court's decision, I don't know whether
It's
It
not
does-
these
it
are
can't
the legal
No, no,
experts,
it
but
can't
not legal
because
I think
we
that's a
have-
no. I don't think so. I don't.
Okay.
But
Did you
let
want to
me
finish
just
your
say
point?
that it does emphasize the point for Tanzania. Basically, we have an incomplete constitution-making process, and I don't know when we are going to pick it up again. But this was one of the issues that have been raised in the draft in the Warriors Commission, which I was a member. That it's about time, if you're going to have a multi-party competitive system, it's about time that you introduce some of these critical elements of the system, including challenging results. And you know, our
Time
law
will
now,
tell.
our law right now even protects the election commission. In the law that establishing the electoral rules, it cannot be questioned on anything that they decide to
All
do.
right, time
So,
will tell. We
these
might
are
revisit
things that we need to
the whole process
yeah,
again.
so-
Very quickly, Professor.
Yes, I agree with Kweka. You know, sure, the decision of the Supreme Court in Kenya did establish some democratic standard, not just for Kenya, but for all of us. You know, because one of the aspects of democracy is, of course, the rule of law and the independence of the judiciary. So, but and I'm glad that she introduced an aspect of that. You know, not taking independence of the judiciary for granted as such. Because when we say a body or an institution is independent, usually we focus on it is independent of government and perhaps the incumbent government. At that point, it may not be all that independent vis-a-vis other groups, for example, or another government that comes in. So I think that kind of footnote is important. But at the moment, let's say, because it is important to all of us, you know, for an institution like this to be independent of the existing government, that it demonstrated that, and that's a good thing for all of us.
Okay. While you're on the floor, do you think the elections, the rerun elections, will take place on October?
That I don't know, because we only have this
The
information.
opposition party has always said, no, they can't trust the ICB, the Electoral Commission.
Yeah, politicians say a lot of things. You know, but they are campaigning, you
Who
can
is
be
the-
sure.
who is the politician?
They are campaigning
Yes,
even
of
as we
course.
speak. NASA is campaigning and so on. So we don't know. I think the only serious thing that looks like it might hamper
Yes.
the holding of elections on the set date is this KIEMS system, which is for, again, transmitting the results electronically, because the company involved in that says, no, we can't do it so early. We want to be very careful about this so that our reputation doesn't go out altogether aside.
Particularly when it
yes,
started
there is
going down
that
in the
possibility,
US.
but I don't know for certain.
But another problem, I think, which arises from the judgment is the independent commission, the Kenya Electoral Commission.
Yes.
If I had been commissioner or chairman of the commission myself, given the statement and the results of the ruling, I think I would have probably resigned to do the right thing.
You're referring to the chairman of the
The
Electoral
chairman of the
Commission.
electoral board and probably the director of elections, I think they should consider, in order to help Kenya move forward, because we don't want to have Kenya go back to an election, and then again an election produces results that are not acceptable. And then at the end of the day, you find people saying, it's the same people that did exactly what they did before. So I think to avoid that, I think they should do the right thing. The honorable thing to do is to step aside and.
That means there will be no election.
That means and that is not
It will
just
take a very long
to
time
take
to get another IEC.
it may take a long time, but I think if the Kenya Constitution somehow provides for that they need time.
It's only 60
You know,
days.
decisions like this to be made in haste, and given the difficulties and the circumstances in which this is happening, I think it could lead to a disaster.
All right, okay, so let's go to time, we're almost at the end of time now. Let's go to the last question, and I want you to both react. And I'll ask you, Dr. Kweka, first. Do you really believe lessons for Africa on the Kenyan elections and Supreme Court decision to nullify the presidential elections?
Yes, I would say there are some lessons for Africa. Number one, it's the first time where we're seeing an election results being nullified. So it poses a position that presidential elections can be challenged in court, and results can be either way. They can be nullified or they cannot be nullified. But for me, the second thing of which I know Professor will talk more about it is on the issue of electronic transmission. Now we've embarked in the whole new technology thing. I think we now need to be very cautious about the possibilities of hacking, about the reliability of the electronic transmissions. This because the whole decision has been centered, among others, on the electronic things. So I think Professor will talk more about it on that issue.
No, I think the issue of electronic, the lessons I think that's one. The one I said, the constitutional lesson, I think is clear. How we proceed with these elections, and this it's an emerging trend. Technological voting has not always been with us. And the mindsets, the procedures, the systems we have adopted, the processes, basically presuppose that there will be some kind of manual, verifiable counting of votes. Now, the more technology moves forward, the less that becomes possible. But then at the same time, you have the credibility gap. In other words, it looks to me that it's probably easier to hack a computer system than maybe it is to rig, to stuff ballot boxes, because that can be detected, and that's why we have polling agents. But now the polling agent at the counting center doesn't even know what's going on inside the system.
So very quickly,
that is carrying the results. So
what's the big lesson for Africa?
Let's look into the possibility of what Daudi was suggesting.
Going back to manual?
Going back to manual, but maybe with some kind of electronic support, or
as a backup.
Using technology to serve the manual purpose, which is the expression of free will by the voters to express their preferences.
Okay.
Professor. My position exactly, we actually still have the manual system as the primary and verifying instrument as such. It's simply that this time it was ignored. My advocacy would be to maintain it. Because as Professor Baregu says, and I think my colleague also Kweka said, it is easily verifiable as it is. And by the way, we are still voting manually. We are, we haven't gone to an electronic system of voting at all.
We still have the ballot paper.
You still have the ballot paper. So I would say stay with it as the primary means of doing this. But because of the problems we have had in the past, including the stuffing of ballot boxes and so on, we must have a complementary system of the electronic, the immediate, I emphasize, as the court in Kenya emphasized, the immediate electronic transmission of results. And that should complement the manual one. And if there are problems, you can verify electronically, but also never ignore the manual system.
I think South Africa, some systems have gone completely biometric. In other words, no paper at all. I mean, you go and vote with your...
I must add, though, stay with the small numbers at the polling stations. It doesn't complicate things. We have had this system since, I think, 1992, starting in Mozambique, for many of our countries around here, 1995 here. Kenya came in later. Stay with that. Small numbers, the polling station. It's 450 now here in Tanzania. I hope it doesn't go up, because it makes it very easy as such to count votes and later to tally them.
And make sure that the 4 A's are not messed around.
The last question I want you to answer. I'm sorry, I wouldn't give you time. Thank you, my panelists. Is there a lesson that we should even trust foreign companies which prepare and offer us, Africa, systems for electoral processes?
I don't know whether I can speak to that in a full sense, because we've had problems. Some of these companies are also associated with the attempted rigging in USA.
Yes.
So it raises a lot of questions in terms of...
Hillary Clinton has complained.
But apparently
Yes.
this company was actually first recruited by Raila when he was Prime Minister.
Right.
Yeah, apparently.
Anyway.
Just
Well,
look at it.
my panelists, thank you very much for your analysis of the Kenyan situation. Viewers, the 2017 Kenyan elections have raised many fundamental issues in terms of organization, supervision, and the conduct of a free, fair, and credible elections, not just in Kenya, but also in Africa. The decision of the Supreme Court to nullify the results, hence the election of the president, could be summed up as a milestone in Kenyan political history, as well as in Africa. In Africa's multi-party systems. Reading its ruling, or its statement on its ruling on why it nullified the presidential election on Wednesday the 20th, the Supreme Court blamed the country's Electoral Commission, the IEBC. The judges said, according to the BBC, the 8th August poll was neither transparent nor verifiable. Has the Kenyan Supreme Court taught Africa the independence of the judiciary? Are there, if any, fundamental lessons for Africa to be learned from what happened with the elections in Kenya? Free and fair, transparent, and credible elections as per country's constitution, with a rerun of elections that take place on the 60 days after, as decided by the Supreme Court, take place, time will tell. This is all we have for you today. Until next Sunday at the same time, and on Thursday at 15 hours for the repeat program. On behalf of my panel, Dr. Gifty Kweka, Professor Mwasiga Baregu, Professor Daudi Mukangara, retired Judge Thomas Mihai was not around, as I said at the beginning, and my TBC crew. Thank you, viewers, and goodbye.